Welcome back, listeners, to the Narrative Mindset Podcast. Here at the Narrative Mindset Podcast, I basically narrate, narrate my mindset and try to do it in a surreal storytelling way that includes a little bit of psychology, a little bit of some stories will include a little bit of mental illness, uh, therapy, and some will just be my mental narrative mindset on certain subjects. I appreciate you tuning in today to this episode. When you get time, go back and view previous episodes so that you can kind of understand the view of this podcast. Also, feel free to download, uh, stream, or subscribe, or leave a comment. Feel free to rate uh, my episodes. I am just starting out, so it will get better. As a matter of fact, I just to include some information with you all, I do my podcast in my dining room, and I had a microphone. I think it was a HyperX microphone, I believe, and it's a pretty good microphone. But I thought about it and I said, well, let me try it. I ended up getting a Troy Studio, which is a little box, a little padded box. And I put my microphone in there and tried to do that. And that was okay, but it wasn't really the quality that I was looking for. So then I said, okay, what else can I do? So I kept looking and looking and looking. And then I was going to get I was going to get one of the professional microphones. Uh, I forget what it's called. Uh, a Shure microphone. I was going to get one of those, but when I went to go get it, it didn't have the microphone itself was like, I think I could get one for like $100, but then you had to get the XLR plug, and that was like $149. And I said, well, let me keep looking. So I found a microphone. Uh, I think it's called Five Fine microphone, and it's pretty much the same thing as the Shure microphone. That's the one I'm using right now, and it has controls on the back of the microphone. It has a headphone jack in the back of the microphone, but it's still you still have to it has its own like noise filter, but you still have to do a little extra that I found out. So I kept going, and I end up luckily I got it's a the microphone basically has its own studio. So once I got that figured out and put on, now the sound sounds much richer, much better quality. And then I also, when I'm done recording, I run it through Adobe Podcast Cleaner, and I also use WavePad, which is a good free system. But usually after I'm done with Adobe Podcast Cleaner, that cleans it up pretty good. So just to give you all a little bit of information on just in case you have your own podcast, or you plan on starting your own podcast, or you're wondering what kind of equipment to get or whatever. That's the equipment that I have. And I would recommend the Fine. You can get it on eBay, on Amazon. I definitely would recommend that over the HyperX microphone. HyperX is like, I think, I don't know, maybe 20 or $30. The Fi Fine is, uh, that one is, I think 79, I think. It's a little bit more expensive, but it is a much better, microphone. And then I would recommend getting the little round thing that goes over the microphone, and uh, it's got the little air filter up front to, I forget what it's called, for your breath or whatever. But, enough about that. This episode will delve a little bit into, my dad. I did one about, and I did an episode about me, my introduction to the world, and the funny accident on how my birthplace came about. And I did another episode on my mother and father and a little bit of their history and a little bit of my relationship in there. And now I'm doing just the separate, my dad in this episode. Um, First of all, my, I guess when I was little, my first impression of my dad was, I mean, at least in my generation, we had a healthy fear of of uh of elders. So my dad was like, it was just like, you know, those were back in the days when you just didn't do certain things, So the my first impression of my father, was, was he could whoop the world. That's the funny part. It was just like nobody can beat my dad. I just didn't see anybody beating my dad. That's funny. Uh, my dad's height. My dad was like 5 foot. He didn't really stand out too much. He was just 5 foot, but don't get it twisted. He was 5 foot, and would, 5 foot of old school, you know, uh, old school whooping. Not just, don't think because he was 5 foot, it, 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 it was going, anything was going to change. He was 5 foot of old school, you know. Um, my dad really never talked about, uh, Vietnam and going there and whatever he may have experienced or or went through over in Vietnam, because I think I said in another episode that men, we're known for keeping things in. And, a lot of veterans never say anything about their experiences over in Vietnam because they go through so much, they see so much. It's just like once they're done, they just don't want to talk about it. There's nothing to brag about or nothing to talk about or anything. As far as the war, it, I believe it did shape the man that my father became, because it made him, much more angrier, much tougher, much more, like a really cutthroat, uh, uh, a really cutthroat kind of person. And the scars that he carried from it, he didn't have any visible scars that he carried, but I think there were a lot of mental scars that he carried, as all soldiers do carry from the war. Uh, and he never really shared any stories about the war, because that was just like I said, as a soldier, that's something that they pretty much avoid because, you know, I've never been to war, but I'm pretty sure it's definitely, the real deal, you know, uh, the average wannabe gangbanger, he goes to war. He's coming back and telling that gang, y'all can keep this. I hadn't seen the real stuff, you know. As a child, his being in the army, um, I don't know. As far as I could see, it just affected him, um, just real quiet, and always, just almost like he was just unafraid of anything. Real quiet, unafraid of anything, and would take on, you know, whoever. It just didn't matter. And I think that's how I think that's how the war shaped him. Um, I feel proud of anybody that serves in the war because, even with any flaws that he may have had, mentally, I didn't see any physical flaws, but I was proud of him for serving, not only serving his country, but I was proud of him for I'm proud of anybody for going somewhere where, you know, people who know how to shooting at you. I'm proud of anybody who can go somewhere and you got some sniper 2, 3 miles away that you can't even see, you know, shooting at you. And, they tell you, not, don't stick your head up when you ain't supposed to, keep your mind on, the task at hand and things like that. I'm proud of anybody. So, and saying that real quick, I'll say, uh, if there's any veterans listening to this, I thank you for your service. I think his drinking I think it was somewhat tied to the war. It may not have been uh, directly tied to the war, but it did have a link to it because a lot of soldiers, they go over there and they come back on drugs or with diseases, and some of them don't come back at all. Some of them come back, burned up or maimed or whatever. And as far as his drinking starting before the war, I wasn't born before he went to the war, so I don't really know when, if he was a drinker before the war. My mom did tell me that that he was a really nice person before he went to the war. Alcohol also, I believe, did magnify the darker parts of his personality because my mother told me he was a much nicer person before he went to the war. And, and he, after the war, he was, he was, a mean guy, woman beater, just as far as I was told, he was like, did a 360, you know. My father never talked about not knowing his father. It was something that he just never mentioned. My mother just, you know, knowing him, she said that was mostly part of his problem is that he didn't know him. I think it had a lot to do with not knowing his father, had a lot to do with the way he treated, he treated people in general, including me and my brother and women and other people he came in contact with. I'm not really I'm not really sure. I would assume that he took some effort to look for his biological father, but I'm not sure how extensive the search was because back then, there were no computers. It was much tougher to in that particular situation to find a father. You couldn't just go online and look, or I mean, you had to go through like extensive uh, work. So I'm assuming it may have been a thought, but I don't know if he really you know did it because he didn't have the tools that we have today. He did carry. Uh, well, actually, let me take that back. He didn't carry resentment about the fact about the fact that missing piece in his life. He never, that I knew of, he never really complained about it and whatever. Because, like I said, my father was, he was too much of a tough guy, and I really never saw him, uh, break down or anything like that. As far as my grandfather, his stepdad, uh, he did the best that he could as far as uh, filling that gap because my grandfather was, I mean, was one of was one of the good examples of a father that a kid who doesn't know his father. I mean, he was a perfect example that I know of. Having, well, not knowing your father makes you want to be a better father. But in my father's case, he had multiple children with multiple different women. So I don't think that his father missing or not knowing his father, it didn't seem to, make his position as a father, uh, it didn't seem to influence his position as being a father, because unless, well, he didn't know his father either. So unless his father was the same as he was, woman beater and drinker and whatever, then uh, maybe unknowingly it influenced the way my father handled being a father. I think I believe it made him more tougher, and of course he was broken inside because he didn't know who his father was, and that definitely usually breaks a person. We just don't see it. I don't feel that I don't think I repeated any of my father's struggles because my father was a hard worker. He just, there were times he just didn't go to work, but when he did work, it was like he told me one time, he said, I'll break the bank. We live right next door to his job. And the only time he came home, was to make a sandwich. That's it. He come home, make a sandwich, go back to work. Come home, have a quick sip of beer, go back to work, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I don't think that I repeated any of his struggles because I, I chose to do different things. I didn't get hooked on, alcohol. I was never a woman beater or anything like that. Now, if you want me to say that my brother repeat any of his struggles, yes, because at one point in time, my brother was on his way to being an alcoholic. Um, I my father didn't seem jealous of people who had a father that I knew of because he was at an age where he was kind of I don't know, kind of over it. I think. Well, I think he did want to do better, and that there may have been some parts he didn't know how. Because I said when you know how to do better, you do better. So some things could be blamed on he didn't know because he didn't have a father. But on the other hand, he had a stepfather who was, you know, I'm okay with saying he was the example of a man, you know, you know, the old rough hands, pair of uh coveralls, old work truck outside, you know, that type of thing. I realized that I was mom and dad divorced when I was 7 years old, but unfortunately, me and my brother had to experience my father and my mom downstairs fighting, and that's just you know I was young. I think I was 5 or 6 or something like that. We had to experience that. I experienced my uncle and my auntie fighting and all kinds of stuff. So that type of thing is definitely triggering for me because I didn't really, it's different when you experience it. And I think that's why my attitude towards women in my life is so laxed. Even when, at times I feel that uh I feel like, y like, I question myself about going there. I don't, but I question myself. But I think that that's why I'm so lax as far as that's concerned, because I actually, my mother heard my mother fighting my dad, when I was younger, and that was all firsthand, and I did carry anger from my father for the domestic violence against my mother, which is natural for any uh uh child. Any child that doesn't carry anger, that's kind of a different issue. Um I never feared that I would become like him, because I think because of his domestic violence nature, I was way more had more, whatever you call it, hold back. I forget the exact word for it. I had more hold back, more resistance from that. Uh, when you layer up the the times that you experience and have the option to to include domestic violence or not, and you choose not to. Each time you do, you become stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until you're just like this person who can just, you know, walk away when everybody else says, you know, would have did different. So I don't think I ever had a fear of becoming like him. My dad never apologized for any of that stuff, and also the I'm trying to figure out was the violence when he was drinking. I think it was always present at a certain point in life. When he was drinking, it got worse, but I think that it was always present. He just liked, fighting women. I never understood that, but that was something that happened around that particular era. That was just the era of that for some reason. Um, I don't that I know of, family really never tried to intervene, uh, because it usually happened when family wasn't there. So they never were there to intervene. I think he was aware of how much damage he caused. He had to be because it happened, you know, at least two, 3 to 4 times a week. So, he had to know, so that was just, you know, what that was. There was no way he couldn't know. He wasn't, yeah, my father wasn't mentally ill or anything like that. He had good sense, so he had to know. I keep myself from repeating those patterns by making better choices, and even when I've, had a drink, I was never a violent person, to commit domestic violence. And in my eyes, you know, I mean, you never do that to a woman. So I don't think that I could do it, even though sometimes I feel like I could, but I don't really think that I could go through with it. So my mother did not marry my father willingly. It was a decision that was made by my grandmother because back in those days, you married whoever your grandmother liked, and that was the way that those things went. Parents back in those days had total experience over your choice over who you were with, and that's one reason why I say I thank my grandmother for me being here because my mother, she wanted to marry her high school sweetheart. And if that had have happened, I wouldn't be here. So I thank my grandmother for me being here because as a parent back then, their choice was the last say. Yeah, my mother was very resentful of her mother making her marry my father because that was who she liked, and she wanted to marry her high school sweetheart, who she ended up marrying later in life. But yes, my mother was very resentful about that, and I also think that she did feel trapped in that marriage, and I think that, in my opinion, I feel that in that entire situation, I think that, and I can't blame her because after I say this, I can't really blame her for doing this because you with a woman beater who you really didn't want to marry anyways. He cheating, you doing this, going to work when he get ready, and all this. Also, I can't blame her when I say this, but I do feel like my mother, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the life she wanted. Uh, she dreamed of when she closed her eyes, and it didn't include, me, my brother, or my father, because she didn't want to marry. So I think that um, that she did feel trapped, and I think uh, she constantly said how much that she resented her mother for the choice that she made her make. Uh, I don't really think my grandmother really knew what kind of man my father was, or maybe she didn't. Um, maybe she didn't. Uh, I don't know. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she ignored it, or maybe she was only stuck on the good parts. Because from what I was told, my father lived right next door to them. So maybe she, maybe, I don't know, maybe she only knew paid attention to the good parts, I guess. I don't know. But, but I don't think she, well, let me take that back. Let me take all that back. My grandmother wasn't stupid. So she probably knew what kind of man he was, but by the time she maybe found out that he was an alcoholic, woman beater, all this kind of stuff, it was too late because they were already married. Already had, probably one child, another one on the way. No, no, it doesn't feel strange to thank my grandmother for my existence, because it's the truth. Because if you look at the situation, my grandmother made my mom marry my father. You know, my mom and my dad had me and my brother. So if you take my grandmother out of the equation and her not make my mother marry my father, that takes him out the picture, which in turn takes me and my brother out of the picture. So I just I go by the facts. Yes, my mother always did talk about her high school sweetheart. She didn't really tell me much about him, but she did always say that that's who she wanted to marry. She didn't want to marry my dad, and that was kind of like now after a while, it kind of sounded like a broken record, but I can see why. It was not a shock when she eventually married him, because that's what she wanted to do. I think she saw him uh, at a high school reunion or something, and I guess he said, hey, he waited all these years and finally said, hey, um, will you marry me or whatever? At this point, I don't really, I'm not upset with him about, they end up getting married and they're together. No, I'm not upset with him about them being married. I am a little bit upset about the fact that my mother, you know, she had all this resentment against her sisters and her mother and my dad and whoever else and this, that, and that. You got all this stuff piling on top of each other. And then she finally gets to a point to where, she sees her high school sweetheart at a reunion. He said, "Hey, would you marry me?" She says, "Yes." Okay. So in her mind, she's thinking, "Okay, we're finally uh getting married, so now I can finally, you know, be be the woman I always wanted to be. I can finally be the wife and not be the full load carrier of everything." And after they got married, he ended up having uh, two strokes. One he didn't even know about. So now, you know, he's, bedridden and she's taking care of him. She's old. And, it's just like, you know, it, it almost looked like, God took her life up to that point and just said, "Oh, you think it can't get no worse?" And then just flipped it, and told her, "Hey, well, this is what you wanted. This is what you wanted. Here it goes." So that's the only thing uh, that I resent him about is not being uh, the man that my mother needs, and needed when she met him. That's the only thing that I resent him for, But I do appreciate him. He's a good person. I appreciate him for who he is, but at this point, it's like, okay, you've been talking about your high school sweetheart your whole life. You wanted to marry him. Now you married him. Okay, let's. I mean, we're not even to the first hump yet because they got married, then the strokes, then bedridden, and she been taking care of him ever since. So it's like, you know, not being or not being rude to him or anything, and I don't hate him, but it's like, you know, you haven't, you know, shown anything. It's like you take a music artist and, you always wanted this music artist. You sign him, all of a sudden he's he's got a contract. You got to pay him. He's paralyzed, bedridden, and you gotta, you know, it's in the contract that you got to uh, pay for his health care. It's like, okay, it's not making sense right now. Somewhat, somewhat. I think somewhat. Some of my toughness comes from him, but I don't really think my dad really never, was one of them types that taught me how to be tough. It was just I just didn't see it. Despite everything else. I think the war included parts of the man he became, but I don't really was it inside him? I think the war included a lot of parts of what he became. I'm not sure I can say that the war made him an alcoholic or the war made him a a woman beater or whatever. The war did uh put armor around the fact that he didn't have a father. So it just, I don't know, I guess it kind of amplified it. Yeah, I do think he loved my mom in his own way because he always wanted her back, but he just, once you screwed up, a little late after that. So there was uh there was nothing really he could do. My father, he loved me in a different way. In a different way. He loved me in a different way. It was kind of I think the love was in his strictness, I believe. It wasn't a mother's love. It was a true, strict father's love. Yes, I did. The habits that I got from him was the anger and raising of my daughter, which I had to realize that came from him. And I had to understand it and stop it before I became the same person that he was. And I think that I believe that I broke that cycle of violence at that point when I realized what I was doing. I was turning into my own father. And I was uh when I was younger, I was like really angry. I would just spaz out, if anybody said anything, and I think that was a part of my father. I mean, it was real simple. My life would have been different if my mom didn't marry. If my mom married her high school sweetheart from the beginning, I wouldn't be here. It's black and white. I see my father's story as it was a lesson of what not to do because my father it was just who he was, around that time, and it was a lesson on the absence of a father, the effects that war can have on a father, the effects of drinking, of domestic violence, of cheating, of multiple children by multiple different women. Um, ultimately, my father's entire life was, you know, uh, paying child support and then he had a son, then he had another two sons by another lady, and it was just it was a mess for a while, and that was the way uh, he died in peace. But that was uh, the only comfort that he had when uh, when he got on disability and they couldn't take his money. That was the only comfort he had. But that'll be it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.